Thank you all. If I could get you to settle in, I think we're ready. Our technical issues have been corrected and are ready to go. So good morning. My name is Dina Archuleta. I'm the Interim Economic Development Director for Bernalillo County, and it is my extreme pleasure to be here this morning in front of you with this esteemed panel and talking about something that is, I think, near and dear to all of your hearts, or you wouldn't be here, and also really important to Bernalillo County and clearly to my department, the economic development folks. Whether personally or professionally, broadband service affects all of our lives daily. Today, this event not only is sponsored and spearheaded by Commissioner Jim Smith, he is completely committed to this issue, as you know, throughout his history as a state representative. I'd like to quickly thank my staff who coordinated this, along with help from Paul Evans, Tom Thorpe, Blaze Culler, all from our communications department. This event is designed to examine the challenges here in the East Mountains and how they can be addressed from the most positive aspect and the most positive outcome. Before we begin, I'd like you to know some of my team and the folks that have worked so hard and diligently, and also will be around for discussions at the roundtables, which will come after the conversation that we'll have up here. I'd like to introduce my Assistant Director, Marcos Gonzales. Thank you, Marcos. Dan Beeman, who is my Special Projects Coordinator. Sulema Lenz, who's my Senior Analyst. Sean Perry Turner, who is the Business Development Specialist, and really did yeoman's work in coordinating this event today. So thank you, Sean, as well as the rest of the staff for being here this morning, bright and early. Now, please let me share a little more information about Jim Smith, our Commissioner from District 5 and our host for today. Commissioner Jim Smith was sworn in as Commissioner for District 5 in March of this year. He has recently retired from the New Mexico State Legislature after 8 sessions of service in House District 22. His district encompasses the unincorporated area of the East Mountains of Bernalillo County, along with Edgewood, Placitas, and Algodones. In the New Mexico House of Representatives, Jim served on the Appropriation and Finance Committee and the Education Committee. For 2 years, he also chaired the Government, Elections, and Indian Affairs Committee and championed the open government and transparency. Jim passed numerous bills that allowed more public access to taxpayer initiatives. And with that, I'd like to introduce Commissioner Jim Smith.
Thank you, Dina. Apparently I'm a little bit taller, so I'll move this up. I'd like to thank Dina and Sean Perry Turner and all of your team for putting this on together today, for coordinating this event for us. I would like to add a little bit to what Dina said about my service in the legislature. One of the biggest issues I had, and a lot of you know this, was the broadband in the East Mountains. We're an underserved area, and I have passed a lot of legislation to try to improve that, and I see a lot of people in the audience that were so helpful to me, Lisa Davis, Paul, a lot of other people, and I'm going to miss a lot of people if I try to name everybody here that I've worked with. I've also worked very closely with everybody that's on the panel over the last number of years to pass a lot of legislation to try to improve broadband out here. And there's also some people in the audience that I'll mention in just a minute, but not only is higher speed internet a problem out here, as you all know, we also have a problem with land mobile radio. And I have Chief Perez and Sheriff Gonzales here to talk about the issues that we have about compatibility of radio signals, because most of you remember a couple of years ago when we had the Doghead fire, we had some issues. And so they're going to discuss those in great detail. And there's several other, there's a guy here, Ovidio Villaruca, if you could raise your hand. Ovidio, I've worked with for a number of years in the legislature. He's with the Public Schools Facilities Authority, and he and I passed a piece of legislation a couple of years ago together, and I think Eric's here as well. Eric Moore has worked with me as well to bring a statewide broadband network to New Mexico. And so I'm not going to go into the weeds about all this legislation because I'd bore you to tears, but I do ask you to go talk to Eric and Ovidio after we get done today and talk to them about what all these different pieces to the puzzle are to get better and more reliable internet service out here. I'd like to start with our panelists to tell you who our panelists are going to be today. Sheriff Manny Gonzales, Chief Greg Perez, Leo Baca of CenturyLink, Damian Donkels of AT&T, and Damian and I worked very closely this last legislative session to pass a bill called small cell legislation, and I'm sure Damian will go into the weeds on what small cells do for you. And then a longtime friend of mine, Steve Grabiel of Higher Speed Internet Services, is here to talk about wireless internet service providers. And following this discussion that we have up here, we're going to break up into just kind of roundtable discussions, and that'll give you more time to actually work one-on-one with some of these panelists. There's a number of other people here today. They're going to help mostly from the county. I'd like to recognize Enrico Gradi. He's the Director of Planning and Development Services. Blaine Carter is the engineer for the Technical Services Department. I'm going to butcher this one. Ellie Bourgeois. Is that close? Thank you, Ellie. He's the Deputy Chief of Information Technology. Albert Katanak, I don't see him. He's with New Mexico Surf. From SkyBoost, Jim Gosnell and Andrew McDaniel will talk to you in the roundtable discussions. They have a very interesting product. And I'd also like to thank Tyler Nunn, who couldn't be here today. Tyler Nunn is my political analyst, and many of you probably communicate with him more than you do me, and I'd like to thank him for helping with this. Also, the local manager of Los Vecinos, Jim Wolfel. I don't see him here. Oh, there he is back there. Thanks, Jim, for you and Joshua and all of your team for putting this on today. So now we're going to get started with the program, and I'm going to turn it over to Sheriff Gonzales.
Good morning. They just asked me to give you a brief on our LAN mobile radio system. So basically where we're at right now with that system is that companies usually design those systems for about a 20-year service life, and ours is at the end of that life. So right now, pretty much where we're at is that this system is compromised in terms of our ability to communicate, because obviously there's no parts for this. Sometimes these companies go out of business, and so at this point we're piecemealing this system as we speak. And so the infrastructure, and I'm sure you're well aware, is that it's outdated. And so what we need is the city of Albuquerque and Bernalillo County are working on a joint RFP. And I believe Dina Archuleta just informed me that there's about $500,000 that's been appropriated for that venture. So for us right now, what we're looking at is helping out and giving them information on what we need. We need that interoperability in the event we have a crisis in the East Mountain or any part of the county. We have to have the ability to have those mutual aid agreements between other counties, the city, the state police, and they have to have the ability to be able to come into Bernalillo County in the event we have an emergency and be able to communicate immediately. And just to give you an example, if we have a SWAT situation that may occur up here or any part of the county, basically what we're doing at this point is taking a group of handheld radios that we have assigned through OEM, and we'll loan those radios out to whatever agency that we're dealing with. And that's very archaic. That's not efficient. That's not the way you run a 21st century government. So we need to be able to have these discussions. We have been working on this and asking for this type of system for the last 3 years and 3.5 years in my term. So this isn't something that is new, but is much needed. Obviously, we've seen the frustrations that occurred during the Doghead fire, and oftentimes what we're doing is we're having to depend on OEM to go out and get these other systems like the COW system, the cellular on wheels system, just to be able to have the ability to communicate. And what concerns me is those delays. And to me, we can't afford to have those delays when it comes to people's safety. And we don't want to jeopardize anybody's safety. So we'll continue to ask. We need to be, I believe, a little bit more aggressive on acquiring the funding. Basically, the estimated cost for this new system is estimated at about $30 million. $13 million of those dollars would I believe is or would be responsible for the county. The other 17 million would be for the city to develop that infrastructure. So as we move on, and there's other questions, if you have those questions, I take them, and I'll even take those questions right now. But if not, I will pass the mic, and that would be Chief Perez.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Sheriff. And the Sheriff is absolutely right in everything he stated. We've had issues with our ability to communicate via landline radio for quite some time. We also have been working on it for quite some time. Excuse me. Last capital outlay, the Bernalillo County did put away $1 million towards the system and its infrastructure. It's just the tip of the iceberg if we're looking at close to $13 million in order to get this system up and running. For us on the fire department side, our challenges are no different than those of our partners at the Sheriff's Department. It's the ability to respond and be able to communicate as we are doing that response. We put a few things in place to try to help Band-Aid, for lack of better words, onto the system, like mobile repeaters inside of some of our rescue units and other things like that. But at the end of the day, it's critical that we get the infrastructure that is, again, it's out of date, it's end of life, and it's time to get that infrastructure back up and built into the current century. My understanding is that our towers are actually failing daily. So those are things that are critical for us. Every winter we have issues with our towers and have to switch over to different repeaters or different systems located throughout the city. So the issues are real, and the criticality of it is justified. So any support that we can get in trying to get those systems up is definitely beneficial to each and every one of you residents in the East Mountains and the county as a whole. And as the Sheriff stated, I'll stand for any questions that either of you may have now or during the roundtable session. And thank you for being here. It's always a pleasure to get up to the beautiful East Mountains and get to spend the morning here. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. And we're going to change the discussion a little bit, but as both Sheriff Gonzales and Chief Perez told you, sometimes it's legislation, sometimes it's just money. And you're going to see on the next GO bond election, we're going to have a request for some funding for this land mobile radio. But as Dina told you early on, when I served in the legislature, I was on House Appropriations and Finance Committee, and we appropriated $10 million to this project, not just for Bernalillo County, but for the state. So this coming week, Dina and I will be up in Santa Fe trying to get some of that money back into Bernalillo County, some of the money that we appropriated this last session. So we're working on it. We're doing the best we can as fast as we can. With that in mind, I'm going to move the discussion a little bit more to the broadband issues, and I'm going to start off with a good friend of mine who I've worked with before I ever got in the legislature, actually, back in the days when Sue Wilson Beffert was your state senator. I was working with Leo Baca on issues about internet service to schools and other types of internet provider issues. So I'm going to turn the discussion now over to Leo Baca with CenturyLink. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and I'll lower this just a little bit here. Good morning, everybody. I'm Leo Baca. I'm a Government Affairs Director with CenturyLink here in New Mexico. I deal with issues such as this, the need for broadband and more broadband throughout the state of New Mexico. And I was asked to talk about what are some of the challenges in bringing broadband to areas such as the East Mountains. So what I did to prepare for this is I met with our engineers. The folks that feed on the street here in the East Mountains are the ones who work this area. And I asked them, I said, what are your challenges to bring more broadband into the East Mountain area? And they did give me some pretty good examples, which I will share with you. One of the biggest challenges is access to capital dollars, just access to funding. To be able to place the broadband in areas that are somewhat high cost, more so than if you're in the middle of the city. And there are more people moving to the mountains from the city, from Albuquerque, or moving here from California, or moving here from Texas. And where they came from, they might have very high speeds, and then they come out to an area here, a rural area, where you don't have the speeds that you had in the city. And so that's a big challenge for us as well to try and meet those expectations. Time tying into the cost issue, in rural areas, sometimes you have large lot sizes. And so you may have a subdivision out in the East Mountain area where there's 2 or more acres per lot. And when you have that type of an arrangement, it becomes very costly to deploy in areas where you don't have the densities that you would have in the city environment. And then again, in this area, we are in the mountains, so there's a lot of rock. And digging in rock, trenching in rock is very expensive. And so that only adds to the costs and the capital dollar situation that I mentioned previously. Another issue that the engineers brought up with me is some developers, I'm not saying all of them, but some of them, they have the opportunity to work with us to deploy the broadband in their development as they're putting in all the other utilities. And some developers have refused to do so. And so when the development is being built, there's no broadband in the development because of that. And even then, some developers still sell the lot with the customer thinking that that they do have broadband in the development, and they don't. So when you build your house and then you're calling us up to get your broadband and we say it's not in that development, then you can see how the expectation goes unfulfilled in that case as well. And so we're trying to work closer with the developers to see if we can avoid doing that, and work closer with them to deploy broadband in developments, in the initial stages of a development where it's much cheaper to do that as trenches are open for other utilities. One other thing that I personally ran up against, this has been several years ago, is there are some folks, maybe not anyone in this room, but there are some folks that they don't like us digging up the roads, and they don't like us digging in their yards to provide facilities, and they don't like the view of a pole line where you sometimes, because of the rock, you have to go on the poles, or you have to place poles to be able to deploy the facilities to an area, and they don't like the view. And so in that case, we sometimes run up against some obstacles in that arena where we're having to, for aesthetics reasons, we're having to do something different. And again, if you have to dig to avoid the pole line, those digging costs are much higher. So one of the other things I asked our engineers was, okay, so we have all these challenges, so what are possible solutions? Because you don't want to talk about how bad things are without at least coming up with some ideas on how you can resolve it and try to make things better and make some improvements. So some of the possible solutions are, and I know I've had some discussions with some folks in the room here prior to this meeting, but aid in construction is one key way to help get more broadband out there. And those construction costs can be defrayed by working, again, like I mentioned, closer with developers. Government subsidies. I know Commissioner Smith and I have worked in the past about subsidies that can come from the government to help defray those high costs and put it in more of an area where it makes more business sense for the company to put up some money, with some money coming from whether it's state government or whether it's federal government. Those government subsidies go a long way to help us deploy broadband in areas that are high cost. The Public Regulation Commission also has a broadband fund that they are currently working on. They were able to allocate $5 million from their Universal Service Fund to create this broadband fund, and we're right in the middle of some proceedings with the PRC looking at some projects that potentially could be funded from that fund. And so that is another opportunity there. Another possible solution is to work with providers like higher speed internet. I know Steve and I were talking earlier about how we have been able to sell Steve some bandwidth, and then he takes it from there and deploys his services to the end user customer. And so partnering with other providers, that's going to be in our future. So we're not in there. If there's areas where we can't get to everybody, we're going to look to partner with other providers to be able to get there and to provide customers with broadband. Another service that I'm hearing is becoming more and more viable is satellite service. It's becoming more attractive. They're looking at flat monthly rates and more reliable service. A friend of mine invited me to his house to show me his satellite service, and it works pretty good with very little latency, if any, that you could notice. And so that's another viable alternative too. If there's an area that you just can't get it from folks like higher speed internet or from CenturyLink, there's always a satellite solution, and that's becoming more and more of an attractive solution, both technically and cost-wise. So with that, I'll be available to answer questions at the right time.
Thank you, Leo, and we'll get to the questions here in just a minute, but we wanted to briefly go over all the challenges that all the different, or several of the different providers have, and some of the things that they're trying to do about it. The next gentleman that I'd like to introduce, I worked with very closely this last session. As I said, we passed a bill, House Bill 38, which was a bill we worked very closely with the Municipal League, the counties, a lot of different people to get this bill passed, which is going to allow 5G network. So if you look on your phone and you see a 3 or a 4 on there, that's going to change soon. And Damian Donkels from AT&T, I'm sure has some information about not only 5G, but also his FirstNet project that they're developing in New Mexico. So that's Damian Donkels with AT&T. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Damian Donkels. I'm a Director of Engineering with AT&T based here in New Mexico. I actually came to New Mexico in 2000. At that time, I came with Cricket Communications, and so I actually was part of the team that built out Cricket throughout the whole Southwest, and then moved over to AT&T a couple of years ago. And so I've been kind of involved in the wireless networks and mobile cell phones for 23, 24 years. God, I'm getting old. So I've been kind of involved in the industry from the time that cell phones were kind of a luxury thing, right? Only rich people had it, the people on Wall Street had them, to today where I couldn't live without my phone. And I think most people here feel the same way, right? From I don't remember the last time I printed out a map, right? I've always used Google. I always, I can track my kids, where they're at, where their phones are at. I'll be at the grocery store and my wife will send me a message with, hey, I updated the shopping list, because we have a shared calendar shopping list kind of thing. And she, we'll be at other sides of the store and she'll update the list and I'll go, great, I don't have to go down this aisle and buy stuff. And so it's become this integral part of our daily lives. And at AT&T, probably, we spend probably 90% of our time on our data networks. It used to be, everything was about voice, quality of voice and drop calls and sound quality, and now it's all about data. In fact, as an overall company, and AT&T it's hard to grasp sometimes how big we are, right? So we're a worldwide company. We have 300,000 employees around the world, a big chunk of them in the United States. And so we spend a fairly significant amount of money. In the United States, since 2011, we've spent $100 billion on our networks. And primarily, and we're a landline carrier in about 26 different states, but not in New Mexico, which is darn, CenturyLink. But even in New Mexico, in the last 2 years, we've spent about $175 million on improving our cell phone networks, right? And so we're, some of the things we're kind of doing, right? And we've got engineers based here locally in Albuquerque that are kind of every day they're looking at performance of all of our big cell sites. And so they're looking at how much capacity went through, was there an event that caused blocking, how fast was the data speeds that each cell site is providing. And we're looking at every individual cell site across the state and performance. And we've got other groups that are doing kind of long range capacity forecasting. And so you look at kind of data traffic and how your own usage has changed, even over the last, say, 24 months. You're doing new things. You're watching more video. You're, social media. I'm kind of a social media. I just get addicted to it sometimes, which is bad. And so it's this. There's constantly new things coming out that are changing how we're using our phones. And so we've actually got a dedicated group that's looking at those trends and looking at, well, does Facebook now do video, or does Twitter do certain things, or what's the next technology coming out? And so we do kind of forecasting in our customer usage patterns, and then we look at kind of 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 year out in all of our cell sites and how much capacity do I need at those cell sites. And so we're constantly kind of adding capacity to keep up with these ever-increasing demands and looking at that. Some of the things that we do are kind of new technology kind of things. So we've got lots of our macro towers, and so we're adding capacity to those as we can, but we're limited by how much radio waves we're licensed to by the FCC that we can use. So it's just like a radio station, right? They're licensed to transmit in a certain frequency band. And so we actually license from the FCC, we can use so much frequencies, so much band. And so you're kind of limited in how many people you can get in there. And so the more people you get in there, the slower your data rates go. So we try to increase our capacities up to that maximum level, and then we have to look at other solutions. We can either build more towers, which we are constantly doing. In fact, in the last 2 years in New Mexico, we've added 120 new towers, 120 new cell sites across the whole state. And so we're constantly looking at that. But then we're also working on, at some point, these big towers, they still can't keep up with the demands. And so, like Commissioner Smith said, last year we worked through with the state on what's called a small cell. Tricky name, right? You've got big cells and then you've got small cells. And small cell is essentially a smaller radio, smaller capacity, but we're putting them, and we're just kind of starting to work this. It's like a new trend in the industry on like wood utility poles or street lights. And we put a real small little transmitter there that still meets all the safety requirements required, but it's a localized capacity demand. So say in New Mexico right now, some of the areas we're looking at, like Civic Plaza, because you get big congregations of people around UNM, around some of the stadiums, malls, even some restaurants are triggering where you've got a lot of people there and they're doing a lot of data stuff. And so we're deploying these small cells to provide us capacity in this focused area. And each small cell only covers a couple 100 feet. And so they're really localized. And it's kind of the new way the industry's moving, because our macro sites can't keep up with the capacity. And nobody wants us to build more and more and more of these big, tall towers. It's just not the way to go. So some of the other things we're working on is kind of the wireless industry is still this evolving industry. And so, we've gone through, when I started, it was 1G technology, first generation technology. It didn't do any data. Then the second generation did a little bit of data, and basically it was dial-up phone speeds, 50 kilobits per second. And then you went to 3G, which is a little faster. And then right now we're at 4G, which can give you maximums of a couple of gigabytes, per second data rates. So right now we're just working through, in fact, the standards still aren't quite developed yet for 5G. And 5G is kind of that next, fifth generation, right? As an industry, we don't have a lot of really cutesy names. So the next one will be 6G. But with 5G, it's the wireless environment is still changing, right? Everyone needs more and more data. But now we're also getting to your refrigerator can tell you when you're out of milk, or your washing machine, hey, your dryer's done. Don't leave my clothes sitting in the dryer. Or autonomous cars, and so autonomous cars are going to talk to our cell phone network. So there's new technology kind of things coming out that the wireless industry needs to keep up with, and so that's where some of these new generation technologies come out. And so one of the other things we're super excited about, especially with these guys sitting next to us, is, and we have a booth right here, is AT&T was selected this year by the federal government to deploy a first responder data network across the entire United States. One of the things that came out of the 9/11 Commission after that horrendous event was that there was issues with communication, absolute issues with data communication for all of our first responders. Here in New Mexico, I'm really hoping for a good snow season to help us get out of our drought a little bit. But we have a lot of forest fires. We have a lot of flooding. And so a dedicated data network that our first responders can use is critical to being able to help our communities. And so how that network is, and we're right in the throes of deploying. So we're actually, the federal government licensed us for a little bit more spectrum, and so we're adding that capacity on all of our cell sites across the state and across the country, and looking at kind of that's dedicated to our first response. So in an event that there's an emergency, they're not fighting against regular customers to be able to talk to each other over the data networks. To be able to communicate, to have a system that is, because this is first, like, if your family's, your house is near a fire, and first thing you're going to do is you're communicating with all your family, I'm safe, or this, you're looking at where's the fire at, what do I got to do, and so currently first responders are fighting with you, because they all have phones, they're all using cell phones, on top of the LMR network, but they're fighting with the existing customers. And so it was decided that, we needed that dedicated system for those guys. And so we're working on deploying that right now across the entire United States. And AT&T is, we're a massive company, 300,000 employees. And almost every week we're getting notices on, we're doing this with the first responders. We're doing this with our FirstNet network. And we're unbelievably proud to be given this opportunity to deploy this network. We've got, I think it's a 25-year lease to be able to support this network, and we're expecting it's going to go on forever and ever. But from a customer perspective, right? This is fabulous for first responders. But from our normal customers, in times that there's not an emergency, there's not a fire, like it's Tuesday morning and you're getting up going to work, we're actually going to be able to let you use that network, you use that capacity. And so it'll actually help your data speeds because of that. Now you need kind of newer phones to be able to make that work and all the normal stuff, but you're going to be able to have access to that. But then in time of an emergency, we'll kind of take that little bit of our capacity away from you guys. You can still use everything else that we've got available, like what we have available today, and then that capacity will only be dedicated to our first responders. So we're really, really proud of being able to have that capabilities. So it's a really exciting time for us as a company, for the industry. On top of just looking at kind of our normal capacity, there's companies out that are kind of third-party testing all of the cell phone networks, and how does AT&T compare to those other companies? I don't want to talk about their names, but and so we actually buy information from independent sources where we're looking at and comparing how's our data rates to Verizon's data rates, in different areas of the state. And so we're constantly always looking at that too, and trying to make sure we're providing you folks with the best possible network we can. So I wanted to thank Commissioner Smith for, his dedication in, what he's all done for setting this up, for giving us these opportunities, and for really kind of, pushing us pretty hard to provide better networks to you folks. So thank you. And I'll be available for questions later also. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Damien, and it kind of makes me smile because I've lived in the East Mountains since the early 90s, probably not as long as some of you, maybe longer than some. And when I hear Leo talk about the different types of technologies, and you can hear from another one in just a minute, I just remember that I've actually had all of them. And probably most of you have as well. You keep, this vicious cycle of going from one kind of technology to another. And we're talking about the challenges of broadband connections, and Leo brought up the idea of satellite dishes. And I've had two of them, two different satellite dishes to try to get better internet service. And I can remember I got one back in I would think in the 90s when I lived off of Frost Road in Mountain Valley. And I can remember having to take my broom out there and brushing the snow off of it, And so besides all these other challenges, we have weather issues out here as well that interrupt our service. And so one of the other solutions that has sprung up in the East Mountains is another friend of mine, Steve Grabiel. Steve started a company a number of years ago. I think he and I were friends actually before that when he was an electrician. And now he has a company called Higher Speed Internet. It's a wireless internet service provider. So I'm going to let Steve talk a little bit about wireless internet.
Thank you, Commissioner Smith, for putting this together. And I take exception to your first comment on that higher speed is the problem. What did we do to you? Well, my name is Steve Grabiel with Higher Speed Internet. We're based out of Moriarty. We're a microscopic company. We employ 4 people out there. We run a wireless network and a fiber optic network out in the mountains here. Our network goes from Galisteo and Mount Air and all points in between. Been running the business since 2005 myself. And I'm blessed to be in an industry where none of us never run out. It can be painful. Challenges in the wireless world can be anywhere from too many people in a household trying to consume too much bandwidth. Another big challenge that we face in the wireless world is interference. My business operates in the IEEE 802.11 space, and what that means to you is probably nothing, but it's any router in your house can operate under spectrum, and your router in the house can affect my servers. And the reason why we do this is because the cost is not terribly large, like stuff AT&T deploys. Remember, I'm a small business. Try to make do with what we have. So interference is a big issue. And out here in these mountains, you've got more wireless, fixed-based wireless internet providers, which I am. Out here there are. So with that congestion in the spectrum, and what I mean by spectrum, it's radio. We're dealing with radio waves. Like your radio, you listen to KKOB or your favorite radio station. Interferences is when someone else fires up a transmitter on the same channel and it interferes with your listening enjoyment. So in my world, anyone can fire up equipment in my spectrum and cause grief. So that's one of the challenges in the wireless industry. Another challenge is customer education. Internet is really like, I'd like to make an analogy to water. You have a 1-inch pipe coming into your house, okay? You're in the shower, taking a shower, and then someone turns on the dishwasher, someone turns on the laundry, someone fires up the sprinkler system. You're not going to have full pressure at that shower. And then you start turning things off, the water flows better. Same analogy plays for internet, be it DSL, cellular, fiber optic, what have you. So those are the challenges within the wireless world, and a lot of that deals with the Federal Communication Commission allocating more spectrum for ISPs like myself. In the fiber optic world, I've learned a big part of the problems we have is pole right attachments. Your P&Ms and your Central New Mexico Electric, they have all these wonderful poles and right-of-way, right? Well, with net neutrality came, everyone wanted net neutrality, right? No one wants to be throttled down. This was an attempt from the federal government to smack down a couple of bad players and penalize the entire industry. Because in my world, I don't care about throttling anybody for what they want to do. I don't care, as long as it's lawful government or lawful use of the internet. The problem with the net neutrality is that it would have been imposed on my business, me having to employ a team of people that CenturyLink and AT&T already have that are dealing with government compliance. I'd have had to hire someone to do that full time, and that would put me out of business. So I was glad net neutrality didn't come through. And the challenges with net neutrality is if I was lumped in together with the AT&Ts and the CenturyLinks, I would have been able to get pole right attachments. Well, since that was rescinded, I no longer have that. But that being said, even though we were lumped in with the big guys and we could get pole right attachments, none of these utilities, the power companies, would allow me to go up on their poles. And thank goodness Jim Smith put together that legislation that allows us now to get in the public right-of-way for a fee to set up equipment to broadcast internet. It's a wonderful thing because the electric utilities do not like giving away or having to deal with people like me running fiber optic on their poles. The other challenges in the fiber world for me is government regulation. Recently, I got in contact with the folks at Planning and Zoning, and they're helping me with an issue that particularly deals with Jim's legislation, so I'm really pleased with that. And talking with the Public Works folks, it seems like it's not so difficult or overwhelming, but my network goes from here and yonder and across as many counties, and my issue is I would like to extend my fiber to areas in Edgewood, Bernalillo County. I don't think that'll be a problem now that I've got the contact. But dealing with these municipalities and the local governments to let me lay this stuff in the ground. And my fiber that I put in the ground is not necessarily very expensive. I can do it relatively inexpensively, even in rock. Sorry, Leo. But those are the challenges I face as a wireless provider and a fiber optic provider. And if you have any further questions, I'll be standing over there with my book that I wrote, which is helpful for client education, if you will. So come visit. Thank you.
Alrighty, I think that's all of our panelists. I would like to mention, Steve mentioned, your router in your house. I came to the realization when I was looking at my little wireless internet network in my house that my router was 10 or 15 years old. I just did, it worked, and I wasn't getting very fast speed. So this past week, I actually went to Best Buy and finally upgraded to a modern router, and it automatically made a big difference in my house. So thanks for bringing up the router idea. Also, there's one other person I didn't recognize in the audience who's very integral in this issue, and that's Richard Clark. If you could wave at us. Richard's with our Bernalillo County Emergency Management Services. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dina. Dina's going to field questions from the audience and before we break up into the smaller groups. Thank you.
Thank you all. I think that was really informative and I think very helpful. Please know that the panel discussion will be posted to our Bernalillo County YouTube channel later today. To get to that, you just visit bernco.gov.